moving into this idea of the low carb, high fat approach as a possible alternative for you if you're not wild about the idea of keto. And then looking at, well, what are those ratios then? We've looked at the keto, let's be more specific now about this one as well. As with keto, low carb, high fat depletes the sugar or glucose reserves in the body, which allows the body to break down fats as a preferred energy source. It happens more slowly because on a low carb, high fat, you have a higher carbohydrate intake and a lower fat intake than on keto, but in that way, sometimes it's more sustainable for some of my clients. A low carb approach can still be beneficial for weight loss, for sure. And depending on activity levels, your carb intake could be anywhere from 50 to 150 grams of net carbs daily. You could even actually take this a little bit higher. Researching this topic, I came across Dr. Stacey Sims' work. She's an exercise physiologist and nutrition scientist. And she suggested for females engaging in light training, so under 60 minutes a day, she reckons 1.3 to 1.4 grams of carbs per pound of body weight per day. In my case, I weigh about 60 kilograms. That's about 132 pounds. So that's around about 149 to 185 grams daily. I'm quite active, but that's too much carbohydrate for me. That doesn't mean it wouldn't work for you or that it would be too much for you. This is where this idea of experimenting and listening to what your body's telling you is important. What does that plate look like? You can see it's quite different to the keto plate. 15 to 30% of your calories would be net carbs. That's around 50 to 150 grams. Fats would be around about 35 to 70%, and proteins 20 to 35%. So you can see proteins remain more or less the same. So what is intermittent fasting? The benefits of it, how to do it, because there are a couple of ways that you could think about doing it, and then what are the rules around the feeding and fasting periods. What is intermittent fasting? It is, in essence, it's about the timing of your foods. It's not a diet. So it's an extended period of temporary hunger, if you like. That's probably the best way of looking at it, followed by a period of eating. It's ideal for females in smaller doses, so no less than 12 hours, but no more than 16 hours. Previously, a lot of the research, in fact, most of the research was done on men because men have very stable systems really in the body from a hormonal point of view. So it's only in latter years that they've done some research on the female body and how it's impacted by the hormone cycle and how it responds to things like intermittent fasting. So I can remember doing maybe 19 and a half hour fasts. And this was, as I say, before they had done the research on female bodies. So I learned the hard way about your ideal windows. But I would certainly say you don't want to do less than 12 hours. You don't want to do more than 16. But I always try and move my clients closer to the 16-hour mark than I do to keep them towards the 12-hour mark. What intermittent fasting does is it empties the muscle and liver cells of fuel. So it forces the body to convert all that stored fat that it has in those fat cells. It converts them into ketones to use as energy. So all we're going to be doing is enhancing what keto is going to be promoting anyway. So if you think about it, if you have your last thing to eat, let's say by 8 o'clock in the evening, and you give it a full 12 hours, that means you more or less are going to be empty by the time that 12-hour period rolls around. Remember, the liver cells have around about 8, they can store around about 8 to 10 hours worth of fuel, and the muscle cells can store around about 2 hours worth of fuel. So you've got a system that can potentially store about 12 hours of fuel. So by the time the 12 hours has finished, you are starting to become quite depleted. And so the muscle cells will ask the liver for fuel, and the liver will say, well, I've got nothing left. And so if you're not putting foods, drinks with nutrients in it, you can have black coffee, you could have black tea, as long as you're not adding things to those liquids, it's fine. So you're not putting any food in, any nutrients in at that point. So what's going to happen? The liver is empty, the muscle cells are empty, but the body has to be able to move. And so where is it going to get the fuel from? The liver is going to grab those fatty acids from the stored fat cells, convert them into ketones, pull the ketones into use as a source of fuel to supply the muscle cells with. So it's an incredible system. And imagine then on top of that, if you were to be active on an empty stomach. Because every extra move you make is going to be requiring fueling. And where will that fuel come from? It'll come from stored fatty acids. So it's such a great system. And I suppose it must be 12, 15 years I've been intermittent fasting now. And my former career was as a professional ballet dancer. So typically I've always been relatively small, which means that my margins are very small. And so when I'm experimenting with this kind of thing, I'm not necessarily expecting huge things to happen, but I want to get a sense of whether they are working or not. And I've never seen anything make me as lean as the intermittent fasting did. So it really is an incredible tool, and it just has these incredible benefits at the same time. Fasting is easier when you're fat adapted, so it gets easier if you can go through that fat adaptation period, and it's easier to become fat adapted when you're fasting. So you almost want to do the keto and fasting at the same time, and they will support each other on this. The reason for this is because the body adapts to using those fatty acids as fuel, as I said to you, and we actually carry quite a lot of reserves. Even a very slim person actually has quite a lot of stored body fat. What are the benefits of intermittent fasting? There are so many. I honestly, as I say, I think it's a tool that's really worth using. Improved mental clarity, cognition and memory. I've had a lot of feedback from clients that they discovered that this was the case for them. They were very aware of having better mental clarity and the ability to focus better. Protection against neurodegenerative diseases. So we want that because of our lower estrogen. We're not as protected, as I've said before, in the brain, and so this can help us with that. Reduced fat mass, of course, who doesn't want that? Increased energy and muscle mass, that's also hugely beneficial. Increased insulin sensitivity, so there's less risk of diabetes. Improved immunity, cell stress response, and heart health. We spoke about the impact on the mitochondria in keto, but in intermittent fasting, it's a great one for promoting cellular health and the capacity to withstand stress at a cellular level. Reduced oxidative stress and inflammation, that's another very beneficial side effect. So how do we intermittent fast? My suggestion is that you start fasting after dinner so that you sleep through most of your fast. I've had one or two clients that have said, no, they'd rather skip dinner, have something sort of mid-afternoon and then skip dinner and then have breakfast, but not many. And in fact, even those clients eventually realized that it wasn't a very sociable way to do it, because everyone else would be eating in the evening and then they would sit and drink tea or whatever it was. So I would suggest you start after dinner. If you're anxious about fasting, just start with a shorter fasting period. So if you're ultimately going to do 16 hours, just start with 12 or 13 and then slowly work your way up to it. You can consume water, plain tea and coffee, obviously no nutrients in it at all. You can take a bone broth. Let's say it's cold, it's winter. You want something that's got some taste to it. You could do a bone broth. You could throw a little bit of Himalayan salt in it. That would be delicious. You can also do whey. So none of those will break your fast. Anything else will break your fast. What are the feeding period rules? You definitely, because you're now compressing your feeding period, you want to make sure that when you do eat, you eat very high nutrient foods. You definitely don't want to restrict caloric intake when you're feeding. You want to eat so that you're full, you're comfortable, you last, you've got energy, etc. Don't be restricting yourself in your feeding period. Ideally, it's going to look like 2 meals. Maybe you'll need a snack in between those 2 meals, maybe not. And you should feel satisfied, satiated, energized, and emotionally uplifted for around about 4 or 5 hours, if not a little longer after eating. Let's have a look at how we put this all together. There's a particular protocol that I like my clients to follow, because we want to mimic their estrogen, well, we want to chase the estrogen and progesterone decline and hike. Putting a plate together, looking at a sample day for keto, looking at a sample day for low carb, high fat, just so that you get a sense of what that should look like or what it could look like. This is something that you might want to print out and keep with you. So a very simple, we've got estrogen along the top. So it's just showing you when estrogen is lower and when it peaks and when it comes back down again. You've got the numbers across the page, which are really just the days of the month. You've got a section that shows when carbs come in at 30 grams or below. And then you've got, so that's your blue section, and then you've got the yellow, which is carbs that are high, so somewhere between 80 and 200 carbs. And then you've got the same period whether you're either in intermittent fasting or you're not. So let's just go through that. We're saying that when estrogen comes down, so on day 1 when you start bleeding, day 1 of your period, estrogen is now low, we start menstruating, and carbs should be kept low. So carbs should be, because estrogen is low, we know that we're insulin resistant, and so we can't handle as many carbohydrates. So we're going to keep carbs really low, and we're going to practice intermittent fasting on a daily basis. Okay, that's the first 10 days of your period. Day 11, 12, 13, and 14, which are typically your ovulation days, you're going to increase carbs to anywhere between 80 and 200, depending on your activity levels, and you're not going to practice intermittent fasting. You're going to bring in breakfast. Then on day 15, assuming you have a typical menstrual cycle, and you may need to adjust it if yours is shorter or longer, after ovulation, and often my clients are very aware of when they ovulate, so you might want to look into symptoms of ovulation if you're not that clear on them. But day 15 through to day 22, you're going to go back to what you were doing in the first 10 days, which is 30 grams or below of carbs plus intermittent fasting. And then day 23 until day 1 of your period again, where estrogen now is coming up, is your time again to do higher carbs and not to do the intermittent fasting. Again, I've spoken about not getting too fixated on apps and things, so just use Google to find out, oh, I like bananas. What is a banana? What's the carb value of a banana? Oh, okay, it's a large banana, 25 grams. Whoa. All right, so I don't want to use my entire carb day allowance on a banana. So maybe I'll do half a banana because I really like bananas, but I also want to have, there's something else I want to have, maybe some rice or some baked potato or something later in the day. So I'm just going to be aware of that. So the idea here really is just the foods you're familiar with, the foods you tend to choose on a regular basis, just have an understanding of what those will cost you in terms of carbohydrates. So this is really just an opportunity to have a bit of a scout, to create a little bit of a guideline for yourself. Oh, okay, a cup of baked sweet potato is it's maybe 50 grams of carbs. So, okay, make sure I have a really small sweet potato because I love the taste of them, but then I won't have anything else in the day, or whatever it is. You're going to play around with that, but you want to familiarize yourself with the foods that you typically eat, rather than, as I say, weighing the food and then using an app and doing that every time you eat. So we just want a general guideline right now to give you a sense of what you need to do and where you need to adjust things. So once you're familiar with those carb values, with your typical carb choices, You can set a plate of food according to your daily allowance. So whether you're using the keto and the ratios in that, or whether you're using low carb, high fat, you can set your plate according to those ratios. You can eat above ground vegetables and salad stuff in unlimited quantities. Remember, we dealt with this in the macronutrient section, where we said that above ground vegetables really are neither here nor there. It's the below ground that are much starchier, so you've got to be careful with those. You then add your protein to that. So let's say we've dished up a whole lot of above ground vegetables and maybe some salad. We're then going to put protein on our plate, because we know how much protein we should be taking according to our body weight and our activity level. And then we're going to add enough fat to that. We might want to put a bit of a starch in. So it could be a rice or potato, or some kind of below ground vegetable. And then we're going to put sufficient levels of fat over that meal to ensure satisfaction, and also to make sure we're following the kinds of ratios we saw on those two particular plates, the keto plate and the low carb, high fat plate. And remember, I've said to you, we're going to be learning about the food language, so we'll be getting into more of the instinct and the listening in part of it. But right now we're just dealing with concepts and understanding in terms of a broader view what that should look like, what that plate should look like. If we look at a sample day for a keto approach, this is if you were doing your day 1 to 10 or 15 to 22. We've got lunch, salmon, above ground vegetables, side salad, and olive oil. Salmon's a nice fatty protein, and then we've got olive oil over our salad. And then dinner might be something like lamb chops with some butter, above ground veg, some quinoa. That would be a day that's around about 20 grams of carbs. So that's a typical keto day. And then if you were doing day, you're ovulating, or just the week before you get your period, you're on a much higher carb day. It could be something that looks like this: breakfast with oats, milk and butter, a handful of ground nuts and xylitol. Lunch, we've got an open sandwich with some butter and salad stuff with some protein on top of that. And then we've got dinner, which might be a cup of stir-fried rice. That's around 50 grams. Chicken, a variety of vegetables. You've got some oil over that. So all in all, you can see you've got a much higher level of carbohydrate coming in on this particular day. So that just gives you an idea of what that might look like. The two, you can see that the two are quite different in terms of the carb levels. And then sample day for the low carb, high fat. This would be for those who want to follow this as a slower way to get into moving towards the keto. We've got some yogurt, a double thick yogurt. We've got fruit. We've got crushed raw nuts. And then lunch, maybe some sweet potato, some butter, feta, salad, and oil over that. We've got dinner of lamb with some vegetables thrown in, some melted coconut fat, rice noodles, and some Parmesan cheese over the top. That's a much higher carb content. Those will be quite filling meals. And as I've said, that's a slower approach, but that works particularly well for some people. And so I think it's useful to have an alternative, and you know yourself best, and you know what will work for you, and whether you can sustain a more extreme, I don't like to use that word, a stronger approach rather than perhaps a slower one. This is the document that you can print out and keep somewhere nice and easy to access. Try to follow either a keto or a low carb, high fat principle or approach. Employ intermittent fasting anywhere between 12 and 16 hours. The protocol that I gave you for the menstrual cycle, when we look at estrogen rising and lowering, was given by Dr. David Yockers. It's a fantastic protocol. It works very, very well. So great thanks to him for allowing me to use that. Always eat high nutrient foods, especially as you start to decrease the number of meals you have on a daily basis. Make sure that they are good quality, and don't calorie restrict during your feeding periods. hopefully that's given you quite a lot to think about. There's some homework in there, I'm sure, and I will see you for the next session shortly.